The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
So, Caleb Maupin, you are a communist, an author, and you are a victim of the deep state, it seems to me, at the moment. Tell me a little bit about the process of trying to sell your new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, on, I guess, Amazon.
Well, it's not a new book. I wrote it 4 years ago. The publication date was August 31st, 2020. And if you have a copy of it, it's a collector's item now because it sold for 4 years. There was a total of 595 copies of it that sold. Not a huge bestseller. Got a review in the communist daily newspaper of Britain, the Morning Star, which I was surprised at the time. And a couple newspapers in India ran reviews of it. That surprised me, but I guess that's because RT is watched in India, and I'm an RT reporter, and Kamala Harris's mother is from India, so it was, of interest. It sparked a nerve there. But overall, I wrote the book in 2020 because I did some research. I came across someone who had worked with Kamala Harris's father academically. So I wrote the book. People read it. They found it very insightful. If you go to Goodreads, the reviews are all still up there. Everyone who read it loved it. Very few people read it and didn't have positive things to say about it. So I wrote it, underground book, self-published pretty much. I mean, CPI, we have a team of people that do layout and stuff, but we published it. No big deal. So it was on sale on Amazon for 4 years. And on Sunday, July 21st, Joe Biden announced he was not running for president. And on Monday, July 22nd, Kamala Harris started getting the presumptive nominee treatment by mainstream media. And then that day at 7:26 p.m., I received an email from Amazon telling me that there was an issue with the cover of the book. And I thought, well, that's weird because the cover's been fine for 4 years. And I actually had it independently designed by someone I paid to design it, and a guy named Arthur Porter, and his name is credited on the back. So I thought it's weird that there's been no problem with this. But I immediately thought, I don't want to lose the moment because Kamala's, getting blasted. So I want to sell it. So I immediately uploaded a blank cover using one of their Amazon templates and resubmitted. Rejected. Resubmitted the next morning, rejected, resubmitted later that day, rejected, resubmitted later that day, rejected, resubmitted later that day, rejected. And I'm thinking, what's going on here? Because the cover's been fine for 4 years. Everything seems to be fine. And now they're telling me the issue was the cover. And so I just uploaded a blank cover. Everything should be fine. Max Blumenthal spoke up and he smelled foul play, and he noticed that this followed the pattern of how COVID-related material was removed by the White House in the times past. So he tweeted about it. Jimmy Dore tweeted about it. I started doing the talk show rounds, and I put the book up on Lulu. Because Lulu is, marketed as an alternative to Amazon. So I put it on Lulu, and it started selling like hotcakes on Lulu. Hundreds of copies were selling on Lulu. Thursday night, I started getting people tweeting at me, tried to buy your book on Lulu. It won't process my credit card transaction. And about 30 people messaged me that they could not buy it on Lulu. So I thought that was bizarre. So I put it on Gumroad as a PDF. And so it's been selling on there. It sold many hundreds of copies. Let me just put it that way. Now, as of Monday, they restored it. No explanation, but Amazon just sent me an email after it had been rejected like 6 times. All of a sudden, even though, they had rejected my last attempt, all of a sudden I received an email, your book has been published by Amazon. And I'm just like, okay, this is a little bit bizarre. And all the links suddenly work. Now, what was weird is, I don't know if you've ever worked with Amazon before, but generally when there's an issue with a title on Amazon, which happens, like an issue with the cover or something like that, it generally what happens is all the links stay up, but it says, you know, title not available. But when Amazon took my book down, it was scrubbed. It wasn't there. Like, it just led to, sorry, this page doesn't exist, and a picture of a cute puppy. They just completely scrubbed it from Amazon. You couldn't read the reviews. It was like the book had never existed. Now it's back. The reviews are missing, but the ratings are still there. The customer ratings are still there, and it's got the blank cover on it. The whole situation is very, very weird and bizarre. Lulu is apparently now processing transactions as well. And they sent me an email saying that the reason on Thursday that no one could buy the book, and no one bought the book over the weekend, no one bought the book on Friday, but now, you know, as of last night, people can buy the book again on Lulu. They're saying that that was because so many people were buying it and maybe it overwhelmed the system. I have a hard time believing that. Generally, booksellers like to make lots of money and they want to sell, you know, many copies of books. So I don't buy that, but I'm glad people can buy it on Lulu now. Glad people can buy it on Amazon right now. But it's very clear that on the day Kamala Harris became the presumptive nominee, one of the only critical books about Kamala Harris, I think there's only 2 critical books about Kamala Harris that have ever been published, mine and another book that was published called Amateur Hour, that was published by the Washington Times Press. Those are the only 2 books. Well, one of the only 2 books criticizing Kamala Harris was removed on the day she became the presumptive nominee, taken down for a week. Now it's back. I guess the adventure continues.
Well, when they were rejecting your book at Amazon again and again and again, was it always for the same reason?
They didn't give a reason. It would just, I would submit it and then it would shoot it back to me as if I hadn't submitted it. And I would submit it and then it would shoot it back to me. You know, it would just not accept the submission, basically. I went through that process about 6 times. It usually took about an hour for them to just shoot it back to me. So
now, you know, a couple of years ago, if I had heard this story, what I would say is, well, look, especially as someone who's a little older, I would say, look, these computers, you know, usually there's human error. You try to submit something and you've done something wrong and you don't know what it is, and then you try again and again as you change something and it will work. But you know, it's probably not a conspiracy. It's probably just a glitch. But now, it would be really naive for me to say that, because we know that over the last couple of years, it's been exposed the degree to which, particularly the Department of Homeland Security, has intervened in controlling what can be seen and what can be said online. There's something called the Twitter files. People think I only care about the Twitter files. I do talk about it a lot, but that was a project that aimed not only at Twitter, but also at Google, at Facebook, at Amazon, at the mainstream news. And you mentioned the COVID period. Well, it really didn't get started then. It got started during the 2020 election, and it was designed to protect election integrity, so-called. But it certainly happened during the COVID period as well, and something called the Virality Project was running out of the Department of Homeland Security through some cutout organizations and universities. So when you talk to Blumenthal about this, what tipped him off? Just the fact that it was being rejected in the content, or
we have not directly interacted about it, but he tweeted about it on social media, asking if the White House had removed it and pointing to how COVID-related material was removed. And then after that, a number of people that had COVID-related books removed texted me and said it was the exact same way, and sent me messages, tweeted at me and said, yeah, this is how they took down my COVID-related book. This is how they took down my book criticizing Dr. Fauci. And
it was because you had an image originally, because you had an image of Kamala on the cover. Right?
I don't know. That's what they said. There's an issue with your cover, right? Is what they told me.
Did they say it was copyright or something else, or
nope.
just issue?
Just there's a problem with your cover. It could be unacceptable by Amazon standards, something like that, I believe. And this is the cover, and it was designed by Arthur Porter, and there's been no issue with it for the last 4 years.
That's what a drawing of her based
Well,
on
I
a
think
photograph?
he took an image of her from, I actually don't know. You have to ask him. I shouldn't speak to this because I might say the wrong thing, but this is our CPI logo here. That's, a design there. There's a Black Lives Matter protest behind her. It's like an image of her. She's like transparent. So I don't know exactly how we went about designing it, but this is the cover that we used.
Right. So let's talk about the book itself. It is a critical book about Kamala Harris, or Kamala Harris. I think, I don't know. How do you say it? Anyway, it starts with some things that you might, if you're on the left, you might already know. She's the queen of mass incarceration. But then it goes on to some things about her connection to the new left, and how she's part of a project to manipulate leftist politics in America. And then it goes on to talk about her father. So I want to pick up with her father. What did you make of Donald Harris? Who is Donald Harris, and what should we know about him?
Donald Harris is from Jamaica, and he is an academic economist, and he taught at Stanford University many years, and he openly described himself as a Marxist. He was an advisor to various Jamaican prime ministers, including Michael Manley, who was kind of like a Bernie Sanders social democratic figure in Jamaica. He was just well known in academic circles as a Marxist economist. Not only, was this book removed from Amazon, but you'll notice that his published works are quite hard to get your hands on now as well. He wrote a book about unemployment and the tendency of the falling rate of profit. That book is, at one point it was on Amazon for cost. There was like one copy and it cost over $1,000. I think it's no longer accessible. But he taught at Stanford University. He's appeared on C-SPAN before. He's an academic economist from Jamaica, and he met Kamala's mother in Berkeley in the early 60s when they were both attending University of California, Berkeley, at the time that the free speech movement was going on. And they were both involved in civil rights demonstrations, and eventually they got involved in protests against the Vietnam War. And they were most likely in a Marxist-Leninist communist organization at that time. We don't know which one. On the Berkeley campus, there was the Independent Socialist Club, which were the followers of Max Shachtman, and that eventually became the ISO, was the Berkeley Independent Socialist Club. It then ended up, joining up with Tony Cliff, and that was known as ISO. Bob Avakian is the son of a federal judge a local judge in Berkeley. He was on the Berkeley School Board, and Bob Avakian was a leader of the free speech movement. He eventually founded the Revolutionary Communist Party. The Progressive Labor Party was very active in these circles during this time. The Communist Party USA was operating, but it was operating in kind of a clandestine manner. Coming out of McCarthyism, they had something called the W.E.B. Du Bois Club that operated at Berkeley campus that was like a front for the Communist Party USA. The Socialist Workers Party, the Trotskyite, the major Trotskyite organization was active. And as an open Marxist economist who was participating in the protests, Donald Harris, he was either a member of one of these groups or he was very close to one of them.
He was a fellow traveler.
He would have been. Yeah. He would have been, and later, in the 70s, there are articles where Donald Harris, I think he was teaching somewhere other than Stanford first. And, he was going to lose his position. And they found articles of like students protesting to keep the Marxist economist professor to keep his job and stuff. And, there's no question he was a Marxist and from the Marxist background. Many people feel that he probably devolved into a bit of a social democrat, and that would make sense with the alliance with Michael Manley. What's interesting also is he wrote an essay after he denounced Kamala Harris's campaign that I quote extensively in the book. And that essay is called Reflections of a Jamaican Father. In that essay, he talks about how his mother, one of his greatest regrets is that Kamala never met her grandmother, his mother, because she was a member of parliament in Jamaica from the Labor Party, and how she gave speeches in giving what he refers to as kind of a folksy, down-to-earth way of explaining the labor theory of value. and how labor creates all wealth that comes from Marx. So, there's no question that he sees himself as a Marxist and is a Marxist economist. He's not Che Guevara, and I make that clear in the book, and you don't find him ever praising Stalin or Mao or anything like that. He's probably a Marxian social democrat economist. His book that he published that I can't get my hands on is about unemployment and the rate of unemployment, and refers to how that fits in with Marx's understanding of overproduction and other things.
Mm-hmm. Now, according to Wikipedia, he's a post-Keynesian economist, as well as a Marxist. So I would think that would kind of confirm what you said about him becoming a social democrat over time. And overall, I think in the American and really in the 20th century Marxist arena, especially in academic Marxism, there was a blurring of the lines between Marx and Keynes. When I started doing this podcast in 2009, I was interviewing Marxist economists, and I was surprised the degree to which the Marxist economists were sounding like fairly traditional Democratic Party liberals in terms of how they understood economics and kind of in a Keynesian way, and what I thought of as a Keynesian way. And when you wrote about him in your book, what influence do you think that had on Kamala Harris? So, like, what significance is it that he was a Marxist in the 20th century, late 20th century style of blurring Keynesianism and Marx?
Well, that's what inspired me to write the book, because I met someone who had worked with his father, or with her father, who'd worked with him. And when I found out that she had grown up with, communist parents, I became aware of her record as just a vicious prosecutor that destroyed people's lives with complete disregard. The drug lab scandal that was turning over false positive results, trying to block DNA evidence so she could execute Kevin Cooper. In Chicago at the Ideas Forum in 2013, she began her speech by strutting around the stage, making fun of leftist protesters, saying, "Build more schools, less jails, build more schools, less jails." And she just had to speak with others.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, how did an ideology and a movement that I have spent my life in give birth to something that is so opposed to everything that I believe to be right and wrong? And that's what forced me to do the research. So then what was interesting is that Donald Harris denounced her 2020 presidential campaign. And that was because when she was being interviewed on a radio program, it's very popular among African Americans, called The Breakfast Club. They asked her if she'd ever smoked marijuana. And she replied by saying, "Oh, yes, she smoked marijuana in college." And they asked her what music she listened to while she smoked marijuana. And she said, "Had to be Snoop, meaning Snoop Dogg." Well, and then many people looked at that, and the timeline didn't add up, because there's no way that, Snoop Dogg had not yet released an album at the time she was in college. So there's no way she could have been listening to Snoop Dogg. I think Dr. Wilmer Leon, when we did an interview about it, he said she had some really good weed where she could hear music from the future. But regardless, she then followed that up with, "Half my family's from Jamaica. What do you think?" Ooh, that didn't sit well with Donald Harris. And that's when Donald Harris came out to the media and he denounced her presidential campaign, and he called it a travesty of identity politics. He said he spoke for her entire Jamaican family when he denounced her campaign, and wanted to, he really did not appreciate the stereotype of Jamaicans as lazy joy seekers who engage in pot smoking. Then he published an essay called Reflections of a Jamaican Father, which is very interesting. It's 10 pages. You can find it online, and it's written very carefully, because I can tell he's under a lot of pressure right now. He's not giving any interviews, and he will not give any interviews. He's retired. He's 85 years old. He's living in Jamaica. And he wrote it in a very coded and careful way with a lot of hints. But one thing that he talked about is that he was deprived of the ability to be Kamala Harris's father. In Kamala Harris's autobiography, which is called The Truths We Hold, which I quote extensively in the book, she says that when her parents separated, the only thing they fought over was the books. However, Donald Harris basically says that's not true. He more or less accuses her of lying. I mean, he doesn't reference that in his essay, but he says there was a very long custody battle in which Kamala Harris and her younger sister, the question of who would get custody of them was brought up, and the courts prevented him from being able to raise his daughters, from having any custody or any access, any visitation rights. And he says that that's because they viewed him as, quote, a Negro from the islands who might eat his daughters for breakfast. That's the language he uses. And that shows an extreme amount of bitterness about the fact that he was not able to be a father. And that also, I mean, this is a man, he's a PhD. He's a professor at Stanford University, but the courts saw him as, the stereotype of a black man as being a lumpen criminal. And that's how they saw him. And it was beyond insulting. And it also deprived him of the joy of fatherhood. And the wound hit very deep. And you read his essay, and it's very heartbreaking. And he describes one of the last times he saw Kamala and her sister in a reel of film that he filmed of them in Jamaica when he took them to Jamaica. He talks about, Kamala Harris, and he talks about her in a certain way, about her running to get ahead, how she was full of energy as a child. There's a lot of little hints in the essay where it's like he's trying to tell you something. He can't come out and say exactly what he thinks, but it's interesting.
Well, how old was Kamala when her parents got divorced?
I believe she was 4 years old.
Okay, so I mean, if she was 4, she may not remember the custody battle. So it's hard to say that she was lying. Although, on the other hand, by the time she's 50, she would know about the custody battle, right? So on the other hand, she probably is at least whitewashing the truth, not to be punny about it. But the question I have is, why do you think it is that she wouldn't speak to that custody battle and the loss of time with her father?
She doesn't want to talk about her father at all. Her mother, she talks about endlessly. Her mother is a saint. Her mother is this ideal figure. She quotes her mother in speeches, etc. But her father, she doesn't want to go there. And it appears, there's a lot written about the phenomenon of parental abduction and estrangement, and how in divorces, children become kind of a weapon that can be used by one parent against another. And it looks like we don't know what really happened, right? For all we know, he was just an amazing father who got scapegoated, or there could be more to it than that. But regardless, that it appears that Kamala's mother blamed Donald Harris for the situation. It appears that Donald Harris was scapegoated for a lot of the family's hardships. There's an anecdote in Kamala Harris's autobiography about her high school graduation and how she was scared that her mother wouldn't come because her father was there. And how terrified, and how she was just overjoyed when her mother showed up because her father was there, and she was convinced her mother wouldn't come because her father was there. And that indicates there was a lot more going on than that. Now, the other thing that I've referenced, though, is that Quebec, right? Kamala Harris, her autobiography talks all about her childhood in Oakland, California. And then it talks about her graduation in Oakland, California. But there's this whole, there were years, most of her teen years were spent in Quebec, in Canada, when her mother was working in Quebec, in Canada, as a cancer researcher. She says absolutely nothing about that. It's like those years don't exist. And that is what, there's rumors, there's things going around. I'm not going to repeat because I don't know. I can't confirm them. But it appears that some rather traumatic events did happen, during her teen years in Quebec, because she just never comments on it. It's like it doesn't exist. It's this giant blank spot in Kamala Harris's life story. And that's interesting. And it's very possible that if something bad did happen to her as a teen in Quebec, or she had a lot of hardship, that she also blames Donald Harris for that. So she doesn't much care for Donald Harris. He doesn't much care for her. The two of them, there is a photograph of her and her sister with him, when they were adults, but he did not attend her inauguration as vice president. He denounced her 2020 presidential campaign.
What was his political reason for denouncing? I mean, he didn't denounce it because he didn't get enough time with her as her father.
No, he denounced it because she invoked the stereotype of Jamaicans
Oh, right,
as
that's right.
smoking.
Yeah. That's right. So that just because he thought she was running on identity politics in a way which was distasteful and hurtful to Jamaicans.
Yeah.
Right.
The other thing, though, is that Kamala Harris talks about her own childhood more than any other politician that we've ever seen. T-shirts. That little girl was me became a catchphrase during her 2020 campaign. Images of 10-year-old Kamala Harris. And often when Kamala is doing things that are more reprehensible, she invokes her childhood. There's the infamous clip of her talking about how she prosecuted parents for truancy. And she, of course, giggles about it and laughs about it. And then her reason is, well, I wouldn't be anywhere if it wasn't for my education. Well, as a prosecutor, your job is to enforce the law. It's not to get revenge or, it doesn't have anything to do with you. And she starts giggling about how she prosecuted parents for truancy, how she had this big stick she could wield around, and she invokes her own childhood more than any other politician. She invoked it against Biden. I was one of the first school class to be bused in Oakland, California. And I don't think you're a racist, but that when she went after Biden, that came up. The latest one, which it happened last week. It happened, I believe, on Tuesday. People have gone over, her maniacal laugh, that unhealthy, bizarre laugh. Well, apparently now she was bullied for that laugh growing up. So we're not allowed to comment on it because she was bullied for it growing up. And it's her mother's laugh. And how dare anyone bring up her laugh? Kamala Harris feels sorry for herself. She's a victim. The world has been unfair to her, and her actions as a prosecutor in California and indicate that she very much wants vengeance for what she perceives as crimes against her. And I don't want to rule out the possibility that there are very real things for her to be upset about, that really awful things did happen to her. She was clearly the victim of racial discrimination growing up. I guess she talks about she had neighbor kids who couldn't play with her because she was black, or was perceived as black, whatever happened in Quebec. So we're not trying to make light of any hardship that she went through. But the point is that Kamala very much sees herself as a victim, and that gave her license to try and block DNA evidence when Kevin Cooper was facing the death penalty. That gave her psychological license to cover up the fact that the drug labs in California were turning over false positives. Reason Magazine has done great exposés of what she did as the California prosecutor. Absolutely horrendous. Her office went as far as arguing against releasing people. Arguing that the state needed their cheap labor, that we should keep people in jail because their cheap labor could save them the taxpayers' money, right? They pay prisoners, or I guess at the time they paid prisoners in California 8 to 37 cents an hour for their work. And if you hire law-abiding citizens, they have to get union benefits. They have decent wages. And so, using prison labor was a way, it was an austerity program in California. And she went as far as trying to prevent people from being released because they'd have to pay somebody else to do it. This is not somebody who has regards for anybody. And it's important now because she is trying to frame herself as Miss Black Lives Matter, and she's not that. There's a lot of people, I think it was Nico House. He used he had the catchphrase, Kamala Harris is a cop. Kamala Harris was the top prosecutor of the Bay Area. She became the top, the top, attorney general of California. She is very much on the side of police. She had an opportunity. There were, some horrendous scandals revealed in the Oakland Police Department, human trafficking, etc. And she could have prosecuted the police for their misconduct in Oakland, and she chose not to. She chose to protect them. Kamala Harris's record is one of being part of the mass incarceration apparatus and having no regard for how people suffer as a result. And she seems to see herself as a victim. The world was unfair to her, so that makes it okay in her mind. And that's a very, very dangerous mindset to have. But what I get into in the book and what the second chapter is about is, unfortunately, that is the mindset that leftism has largely appealed to, that lust for vengeance, libidinal release, right? People who have been repressed, people who've been told to keep in their place, let it all out, let the rage come out. That's the guillotine. And, even the red flag, right? The symbol of communism. I mean, it was the red hats during the French Revolution. The Jacobins wore bright red hats. Red became the color of revolution in Europe. Then later during the 1848, Spring of Nations, etc., red became the color of revolution. But what is red? Red is the color of rage, anger, and sexual passion. There's a reason that, bullfighters waved the red flag at bulls. And that to bring down feudalism, the bourgeoisie found that, fomenting libidinal release was very effective. In feudal society, a peasant can't look the landowner in the face, right? Everyone is told they have their natural spot. They have their natural superiors who rule over them. And people are kind of holding it in and just, being told to just obey and all of that. Well, if you want to overthrow feudalism, you foment rebellion. And the Marquis de Sade was a really big part of the French Revolution. A very important figure. And his thing was all about sexual release. And he went as far as saying afterwards, to keep the revolutionary energy going, they should set up theaters across Paris where they had naked women on display. So men could go and look at the naked women's bodies, become sexually aroused, and their passion would be aroused, and the revolution could march forward, right? The French Revolution was largely an explosion of rage and sexual passion. It was libidinal release, and it served its purpose. It overthrown feudalism. And I think you can look at the Cultural Revolution in China as being very similar. And you can look at, a lot of aspects of when societies have been feudal and you have an uprising and the peasantry in particular rise up and overthrow feudalism. It is an unleashing of rage and impulses. Leftism has become attached to that aesthetic. And in our time, that is not the aesthetic of people trying to use socialist methods to reorganize the economy and have economic growth. It's very much the aesthetic of the color revolution apparatus. That's the aesthetic of George Soros. That's the aesthetic being used, right now to try and destabilize Venezuela. I mean, if you look at what's happening on the streets of Venezuela, that, giving people to unleash their rage and impulses. Meanwhile, communism, especially, starting with Stalin and the defeat of the Trotskyite opposition, communism started appealing to something very different, right? It was very much people's desire to build and construct. And it was almost, another Freudian thing of parental transference. I refer to quotes from people that were big in Stalin's 5-year plan. So they saw Stalin as the idol and the young people of the world working hard to build and all of that. So communism, starting with Stalin, but most especially, with the rise of Deng Xiaoping and what we see now around the world, socialist, anti-imperialist governments tend to be quite conservative because they're offering economic stability. We have a state that will control the economy and ensure economic growth and will protect you from the instability of the West. And that kind of explains why the communist countries of the world are not on board with the LGBT thing so much. And this points to a gap, and that this has always been a weird contradiction within communist, Marxist, leftist politics. On the one hand, you have the desire of the middle class to rise up and rebel and foment chaos. And on the other hand, you have the desire of the broad masses of people for stability with an economic crisis making their lives unstable. And it tends to be on the promise of stability that communists take power: peace, land, and bread. That's a promise of stability. It's not a promise for vengeance, right? And the Communist Party during the height of its influence in the United States, their slogan was 1932, William Z. Foster ran for president. He said, "The revolutionary way out of the crisis." And then later, 1940, Earl Browder ran for president, and it was just the way out. We're offering a way out of instability. People are hungry. People don't have jobs. We're offering the way out. We're offering the road to stability. And they put forward an economic program, demands that could be implemented under the system, but wouldn't be because they cut into capitalist power. They put forward an economic program that would bring the stability working people were longing for. And this is a contradiction. There's always been two souls within communism. Do we want to foment rebellion and chaos, or do we want to bring stability with central planning of the means of production? Which is it? And Kamala Harris she is one side of leftism incarnated. And that's what I'm arguing in the second chapter of the book.
Well, when she was a prosecutor, it seems to me that she would have been arguing on the side of law and order and stability as a prosecutor, someone who's going to put the chaotic elements in society away. And then when she became the vice president, and from what I can tell, she was rhetorically anyway, on the side of defunding the police and of Black Lives Matter, and promising to, and I think she helped fund a legal fund to help the protesters with their legal fees and with their legal problems. And in that moment, she was more on the left, like you described, aesthetically, for creating chaos. I mean, I of course am for giving the protesters, the Black Lives Matters protesters, legal assistance.
Yeah.
And I was sympathetic and empathetic to the initial rioting and protests around the murder of George Floyd. My own children were participated in some of the protests in Eugene, Oregon, which is a very white town, but nonetheless, you know, there was a lot of passion amongst young people to try to do something about police brutality. But I also saw at the time that the protests were being used in an election year by the Democrats, and that it was likely, at least there was more than a 50-50 chance, like a 55 to 45% chance, that the protests would only lead back to the Democratic Party and be used to help get Joe Biden elected, which I think is what it turned out to be. Although people debate me on that. They say the chaos actually worked against the Democrats because it was seen as a Democratic Party operation and that they were responsible for the chaos and people wanted stability. But I think that as often as that happened, there was a feeling that because it was Trump in office, this chaos was happening, and he was a chaos he brought the chaos himself. He generated chaos. I guess what I wonder is if we're looking ahead to a Kamala Harris presidency, and I think there's a good chance we are. I think that all things being equal, unless something shifts, I think the trend is that Kamala Harris will be elected in November. Whether she's elected straight up or if they rig it fair and square, she'll be put into office. And so what do you think we can expect from Kamala Harris in the position of the presidency? And don't you think that maybe, you know, when she's in a position where the opportunity for personal power requires her to be the law and order candidate that's promising stability, she'll be that. And when the opportunity that presented to her is one where she needs to generate chaos, she'll do that. Do you think that we can really predict based on her character what kind of president she'll be, rather than predicting based on the needs of the Democratic Party and the problems that the country will be facing after she is elected?
Well, I'll tell you this. I think if you want to know what a Kamala Harris presidency would mean, take a look at the Uhuru case. There are 3 black activists in St. Louis, Missouri, and in Florida, St. Petersburg, Florida. They have been indicted as being foreign agents. This is something that hasn't happened in America since 1948. We have black activists being charged with being an agent of the Russians, not committing any crime, just for their activism. They're saying it makes them a foreign agent. And they are trying to, you know, if they are convicted, they could get up to 15 years in prison, on this conspiracy to act as a foreign agent charge. And the Biden administration did this. If Donald Trump had did this, there would have been a huge amount of outrage about it. But there's not outrage about it. And it comes at the same time that we've seen hundreds of January 6th protesters get ridiculous sentences for walking into the Capitol when the doors were open. And I think a Kamala Harris presidency will mean a lot of political repression of people that are at odds with the liberal order. And I wonder what that means for me. My book was clearly on a list or something, the fact that they took it down the way they did. And, the other thing is that I do want to get this out there, right? I work for RT. I do report for RT. I've been to Russia a number of times. I've met Putin several times. And there's a time that we actually had a back and forth where I asked him a question and such. But no Russians had anything to do with this book. And I'll just say that. And if I had gone to RT and said to them, hey, I'm writing this book, they probably would have urged me not to do it because they didn't want me to rock the boat. This book is not a Russian conspiracy. And we want to be very clear about that, because I assume that if they come for me because of this book, which, I mean, it appears to me, I knew that her staff had a copy of it, and I got that through a back channel after I published it. I knew that it was in the vice presidential office. There was a copy of it, and I knew that she knew it existed. But it appears that they did not want this book out there as she became the presumptive nominee. So, you know, if they come for me, I'm sure they'll try to say the book is a Russian conspiracy. It's not. I can prove that. They'll have no emails or no communications with which to try and make that argument. But, you know, that may be, you know, what is alleged. I don't know. But I think we can be sure that under a Kamala Harris presidency, there will be a lot more prosecutions like the indictment of the Uhuru Three. And honestly, you know, Trump is making a lot of noise right now. He's going to prosecute the communists, blah, blah, blah. You know, I don't think so, because he wouldn't get away with it. Right. I mean, you know, yes, there has been a call from Marco Rubio and some others. They have singled out not PSL itself, but the People's Forum in New York City, which is run by PSL, Code Pink, and some PSL-aligned forces. They've accused them of being foreign agents of China for running the Palestine rallies. Well, Marco Rubio runs his mouth and says all kinds of things. But if Donald Trump were to get into office and move to prosecute them, probably the result would be the whole left rallying in their defense. However, you'll notice that when Joe Biden indicted the Uhuru Three, nobody did anything. I did stuff about it. Tucker Carlson highlighted their case. Tara Reid spoke up on their behalf, right? You did.
I did. Yeah. I spoke out about it.
On the internet, all the bread tube social media people would just say, well, I heard that they're a cult and that makes it okay. Right. And they even conflated it with another organization called Black Hammer, which is a separate group. And there's been, you know, and they would just say, oh, well, it's a cult, Black Hammer. And then they would just change the subject. And I've never seen.
It doesn't matter if it's black. If it was Black Hammer, it wouldn't matter.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Because what they were arrested for was political speech that they were distributing.
I know.
We have the First Amendment in this country, and that is a clear violation of the First Amendment. And I don't care if they did get $1,000 from Putin directly; they have the right to publish their ideas. And
it's absolutely absurd. So, but I noticed that the left did nothing for Uhuru because Biden was in office, and because probably most likely because the African People's Socialist Party runs in local elections against the Democrats. And Max Blumenthal, who has spoken up for the Uhuru case, he said that's what it's probably about. It's that the Democrats think they own the votes of black people in St. Louis, Missouri, and in St. Petersburg, Florida. And the Uhuru movement, they run against the Democrats in local elections on a socialist and black, they don't call it black nationalist, they call it African internationalist platform. Right. And let me be clear, my understanding of Marxism and my assessment of the white working class is very different than theirs. But it doesn't matter. You stand with them. Right. That is something I always learned from the history of the communist movement is if the state comes for somebody, you stand with them no matter what. And that's something that's been lost in the age of social media. Right. Somebody's cringe. I guess we just go after them. And that's something that we really need to relearn. You know, you don't name names before the committee. You don't do it. And if the government is prosecuting somebody for their activism, even if you disagree with them, even if they have the wrong political view, you don't go along with it. You know, that's just a basic thing. You know, an injury to one is an injury to all. And if we don't stand together, they're going to come for all of us. And, you know, people who lived through McCarthyism can remember that. I guess, you know, we can go into this. We're speaking to mainly people, you know, from a leftist background here on your channel. And let's go into this. When I first joined the Workers' World Party, when I was 19, somebody in Detroit was driving up to Buffalo, New York, and he came and picked me up at my college campus, and we went up to Buffalo, New York. And I sat in the living room of a woman who was 80 years old, who had been a founding member of the Workers' World Party. And she got out the photo album, and she showed us pictures of 1948 in Buffalo, New York, and how at the Bethlehem steel plant, they had fired every worker who was a member of the Communist Party, and how they had a protest out in front of the plant, you know, for the right of workers in the steel mills of Buffalo, New York, to join whatever political party they wanted. And the next day after that protest, she was a teacher in an elementary school. The FBI showed up at her job with a photo. And she was in the principal's office. They had a photo. Is this you at this communist demonstration? Yes, you're fired. She got another job in an elementary school. The FBI showed up there. The same thing, fired. And she ended up getting a job at a telephone company. FBI showed up there. And the telephone company said, okay, are you going to talk about communism on the phone with anybody? She said, no. And they said, okay. And she kept her job as a switchboard operator. And that was the job she had for the rest of her life. But that's McCarthyism, Frances Dostal, who was a founding member of the Workers' World Party, who was kind of my mentor when I was in the group. She told me about how she attended the only protest against the Korean War that happened in 1951. It was in New York City, and it was at a time the Communist Party was completely illegal and completely underground. And how, she was in nursing school, and somebody that she knew who had been a friend who was possibly involved with the party told her, just whispered to her very carefully, be in Times Square at a certain time. They gathered in Times Square, and a bunch of people were just standing there in suits and ties, and they didn't know each other or whatever. And then somebody shouted a code word, and then they unfurled a big banner that said U.S. troops out of the Korean Peninsula. And immediately the police started clubbing them and beating them up. And so they dispersed, and they went down to 34th Street, and they did the same thing. And then they went down to 23rd Street and did the same thing. And a number of people were arrested and beaten and injured. That's what our comrades had to go through. And that's how they learned that whatever your disagreement is, whatever your rivalry is, whatever tensions or grudges exist, you always stand with people who are under attack. You never go along with the capitalist state in silencing people. And I would say that that should extend not just to leftists, but to the right wing. And that's something that, the Socialist Workers' Party brought forward. And the groups that I was in were wrong on that point, right? We had the line that the KKK should be outlawed. We supported government repression against people that were right wing. And I think that was a huge mistake on our part. We should never embolden the capitalist state to take away civil liberties. Look, this one of these communist groups, Freedom Road Socialist Organization, right? They're on the college campuses. I stood up for them when they were under, FBI harassment back in 2010. That's a distant memory at this point, but they've been on the college campuses for the last, 4 or 5 years. And the main thing they've been doing is trying to get college campuses to ban Republican organizations for being, quote unquote, racist. And they get their members to find the screenshots and find out that these Republican groups are racist and get student councils and student government organizations to ban Republican groups. Well, when the Palestine protests broke out this spring, what were the very rules they were using to kick students out of Columbia University, saying that they were racist, saying that From the River to the Sea is anti-Semitic, etc. So by empowering the capitalist institutions, the universities, etc., to silence people on the basis of their speech, they set the stage for that being used against us, because that's what the capitalist state is. It's not our friend. You don't empower the capitalist and imperialist governments to suppress people on the basis of their speech, even if it's for people that we disagree with, because we know that will inevitably be used against us, right? That's.
So let me ask you. Let me ask you a question. Do you think that because I agree with everything you just said, of course, all of it, but when I look ahead and I think about the difference between Kamala Harris and Donald J. Trump, I wonder if there is a path forward that won't include the suppression of politics in America. Because while Trump and the Republicans have said in their party platform that they want to protect free speech, and they're very concerned about that, at the same time, they're saying, if you burn the American flag, you should face jail time.
Right.
If you teach Marxism, you should be deported or sent to Gulag. I'm not sure what they say. But now I don't take the threat of deportation seriously, right? I know that's political rhetoric, but I do remember that the Bush administration, Bush Jr., when he created the Department of Homeland Security and the surveillance apparatus, which then was exposed over time, the promise of the Obama administration was that he was going to come in and do something to restore civil liberties in the United States, and that did not happen. Instead, the surveillance program, extended and expanded, and where we're at now, which is the surveillance of Americans has turned into the surveillance and control and censorship and propaganda, and I'm going to just say the attempt to use mind control on the American population. I think that's true. I think psyops are operating all the time. I know that makes me sound paranoid, but I feel confident I could back that up with some receipts. So do you have any hope that things would be better if Kamala Harris was not to become president, if Donald Trump would be elected instead?
Well, I'm going to answer your question in a way that actually gets into everything I wrote in my more recent book, Where is America Going? Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution. And this is my much more recent book, in which I go into great detail about what Marx wrote in his very famous pamphlet, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. This is the process of liberal capitalist society facing an economic crisis. And what happens is, there's always repression of people that are organizing for the working class, organizing, there's always repression of the working class. But what happens when the ruling class is fighting among itself in terms of an economic crisis, as they're panicking and trying to figure out how to get the economy going again, is they begin to suppress each other. And that's what Marxists call Bonapartism. And that is the natural result of an economic crisis. The capitalists begin fighting with each other. Fascism and Hitler is probably the most blatant example of Bonapartism, but that's just one form of Bonapartism. I mean, Louis Bonaparte jailed all kinds of his political opponents, but rather than setting up fascism, he actually did a lot of industrialization. He passed a lot of progressive reforms, the 12-hour workday, etc. And that Louis Bonaparte was kind of like a Roosevelt figure, but in order to do what he did, he had to repress a lot of capitalists. And the main opposition party, called the Party of Order, the Conservative Party, was forced into exile. And that his Bonapartism was done in the auspices of kind of keeping the glory and the memory of the French Revolution going. But Bonapartism, capitalists jailing other capitalists, and liberal open societies collapsing into authoritarianism is the natural result of an economic crisis. But that creates an opening for communists, because we become the defenders of civil liberties. We become the ones saying, look, if you don't like the drive toward fascism and war is ultimately the outcome too. It's not just oppression and repression at home, it's war. You should join with the forces that are fighting for the working class. And this is, in the majority of the places in the world that have had communist and socialist governments, they've come into power on the basis of fighting fascism. Communists were at the center of an anti-fascist united front, and they led the anti-fascist mobilization. And after the Nazis were driven out, or after the Japanese invaders were driven out, they became the ruling party. And that this is Earl Browder, this is the Popular Front, Georgy Dimitrov. Capitalism naturally leads toward fascism and authoritarian illiberalism in an economic crisis. And so that creates a great opportunity for us to be the defenders of democracy. But we have to be aware of what's going on. Roosevelt was a very authoritarian, heavy-handed leader. He tried to pack the Supreme Court. He did all kinds of things that threatened the power, threatened the rights of capitalists in order to stabilize U.S. society, and he jailed his opposition. And Japanese internment was pretty awful. I would never defend or endorse that, but Roosevelt certainly did that, and that wasn't good. And that Roosevelt was a Bonapartist as well, and that this is the natural result of capitalism in crisis. I would argue that that's where we're going right now, and it's rooted in the tendency of the falling rate of profits, the computer revolution, etc. And it's rooted also in the fact that there is this other economy in the world centered around Russia and China and Iran and Venezuela and Cuba that is not being held back by the irrationality of the market, that is not being ripped apart by the computer revolution, and is continuing to grow, and they can't control it. And so they're facing the rise of a new economy around the world. They're facing their economic system falling apart and collapsing on its own weight with long-term crises or value crises, et cetera. And authoritarianism is the natural direction. And our job is to oppose it. Our job is to build a movement of the American people, which may very well be founded on defending our freedom. It may be founded on defending the American dream, civil liberties, etc. Right? And that's why talking to libertarians is so important right now. Talking to people who may not agree with us about economics, but would understand that we have to fight the low-wage police state and the march toward World War III. I think that's who we should be talking to right now. Most of the left, unfortunately, they just want to talk about identity politics. They just want to talk about who's a big fat racist or sexist or homophobe. And they have become the foot soldiers of the ultra rich and trying to set up their authoritarian state. So that's why I would argue talking to Trumpers is important. I will say, though, that I do see an anti-woke psyop on the horizon. It's already started. The notion that wokeism is all a big conspiracy from China, which it is not. I mean, China is not woke. Let me just tell you that much. I mean, you know, the idea that TikTok is a big conspiracy from China to make your kids have mental illness, that's not true. That's absurd. You know, the idea that Kamala Harris is an agent of China, that Kamala Harris is herself a communist, that Biden's a communist. Trump circles are being filled with pro-imperialist poison. And so that's not to say that Trump, when he takes office, might not do a lot of very bad things if he wins. You know, and we have to be prepared to push back against that. So we're in a weird moment. But the main thing is, I would argue now is not the time to retreat into leftism. Now is not the time to retreat, to just run back to wokeism, because we have a job to do. And our job is not to be loyal to Trump or to Kamala Harris or Biden. Our job is to be loyal to our class, the working class, and our job is to stand against imperialism.
You know, I would say that since 2016 to now, there has been a struggle on the left to overcome what is often called identity politics, or was, and is now being called wokeism, or political correctness is what it might have been called. It was what it was called, I think, in the 90s. And that the people who were like, you know, the people around Bernie Sanders and the DSA and Jacobin Magazine and that milieu were to a large extent anti-woke and wanted to return to some sort of class-based political project and analysis. And what we're dealing with now is not a left that is retreating into wokeism, but just sort of the defeat of that left and the dominance of the Democratic Party over our media landscape. And that also includes taking up some of the people who were part of the social democratic turn over the last decade, roughly, and pressuring them to conform in order to support the Democrats, which they had already been doing. So, you know, I'm not sure. I would just see the retreat into wokeism as not as something that the left, as I understand it, is doing, but rather is a symptom of the defeat of that left, the class-oriented left that had risen up. And, you know, then we could talk about exactly why it was defeated so thoroughly. And I think the primary reason is that it made the mistake of tailing after a capitalist party and capitalist candidate, which was always going to be a path to despair and defeat and tragedy. But do you think right now that, I mean, look, before Biden dropped out, I was relatively convinced that the days of woke politics were numbered. But now, as I'm inundated with the algorithm and I see nothing but woke politics when I go on Twitter, I wonder if I could have been completely wrong. Is there let's say in the middle class society, do you think there's a large population of people who really are moved by this approach to understanding the world?
Well, I got a couple things I'll say on that. First of all, I went to college during the Bush years, and that was the very end of the political setup in America that you could call the late Cold War normal. And you remember these years very well. And in those years, people went to college to think, to learn to be independent thinkers. And average white working class Americans said, you know, George W. Bush is our president. If you don't like him, then, you know, you need to leave the country. You must work for the terrorists. America is great. Love it or leave it, etc. And it was at college that you went to learn, well, actually, there's two sides to every story. Actually, you know, America has done some bad things. Here's some Noam Chomsky books. Colleges it was almost like they were considered to be, they were like the troubleshooters of American imperialism. They were the people that were trusted with highlighting America's flaws to make the country stronger, right? It wasn't, you know, it was in academic circles we could admit the bad things about America and all of that. For the masses, it was, you know, just wave the flag and blindly believe. But in academic circles, we had to talk about America's shortcomings in order to make it stronger. Well, that is not the way it is. Now, average working class Americans are into conspiracy theories. They think that the government is corrupt. It's run by an elite that doesn't care about them. They're angry. They don't trust the mainstream media. And you go to college to learn the party line and to repeat the party line and to be tested about how well you can repeat the party line, and to be vetted for, you know, a place in this kind of intellectual, you know, layer of society, this professional managerial class. It's not for everybody. It's only for people that have proved they are intellectually conforming enough and obedient enough to do it, to be part of it. And it is in those workplaces that people can be fired for making a remark or a tweet that's problematic or whatever. It's in those workplaces that, you know, that people are constantly being, you know, encouraged to sit through identity politics workshops and all of that. And that again, part of the authoritarianism has been cultivating a layer of the population whose job it is to constantly be conforming politically, not to be free thinkers. And that's kind of the change that I'm seeing in American politics. The other thing I want to say, and I think this in regards to Jacobin and everything, look, it's funny because my social media is like exploding right now because of this Kamala Harris book, but I'm trying not to enjoy it too much because I have been through so much. I have been canceled so many times. Social media is rigged and social media is fake. Okay. And I don't want to go into too much detail about it, but social media is rigged. Social media is fake. And the future, we have to build a real organization among working people. We need to recruit people to this kind of politics who would never go looking for it. Who are just working people in their communities who are struggling or looking for answers. People should join an anti-imperialist or a communist organization for the same reason they might join a Pentecostal church, or for the same reason they might, you know, join the Rotary Club or something, because they're looking for a community, they're looking for a group to do something with, and we have to get out of being an internet niche. And that this is something that I'm realizing. And I got to tell you, you know, you mentioned Jacobin and all of that, and I'm glad that they were critical of identity politics, but Peter Coffin and I have been put through hell. I put forward the notion that I was a patriotic American, which I am, and that socialism would make a better country, and that imperialism, the global system of monopoly capital, is not good for American working people. And it became common knowledge on the internet that I was clearly a neo-Nazi. I was clearly a white supremacist. Well, it's interesting because my wife is an immigrant. It's interesting because I've spent years, you know, going to court with police brutality victims and, you know, and all that. But no, I clearly must be a neo-Nazi. Starting around 2016, 2017, I could not even go into leftist spaces in New York City. I went to support the students at New School University when they occupied their cafeteria, and I was taken aside and told, people are uncomfortable with you being here because you're known to be a white supremacist and a neo-Nazi, and that the internet is a psyop and it's very controlled, and that these forces may have been critical of social media to some degree or other. I did not see them ever defend myself or Peter Coffin. In fact, I saw them dogpiling onto Peter Coffin and myself. And, certain people were allowed to be the voices of Bernie Sanders-ish politics, and certain people were boosted. But they were pretty clearly told that Peter, myself, and certain other people were just not on that list. And that this is all just a psyop. It's all just a game. It's about controlling opposition, and it's about keeping it in an internet sphere where we play games and we throw mud at each other and we gossip and all of this. It's not what we need. And honestly, I look forward to the day that the Center for Political Innovation is big enough. I don't even have a Twitter. I don't even have a YouTube. I'm connecting with people that are in the group that, you know, I broadcast for people that are in the group. I don't want to be out there publicly. Right now, I have to be for a number of reasons. But I'm looking forward to the day that I'm not on social media. I'm at the center of a real organization that is meeting real people, helping them live a better life, providing real services in their community while teaching them a real ideology to save our country from this nightmare. That's what I'm looking forward to. So those are my thoughts in reaction.
So you were called a neo-Nazi, not even a Strasserite, right? But full-on neo-Nazi.
Many times.
I got the Strasserite accusation from time to time.
I had never heard of that. And I actually went and read Strasser after people said that, because I had to go research it. And I looked into it and I thought, oh, that's interesting. I mean, and I did all kinds of research about who Strasser really was. What was this? I'd never even heard of that before. My background is as a leftist. I worked for Ramsey Clark. I was in the Workers' World Party. I was the media spokesperson for the International Action Center. My whole background, my whole life story was I was an alienated young person in an evangelical Christian small town who drifted toward communist politics as a teen. So I never thought of myself as right-wing or racist or anything like that. So there you go.
Of course not. Yeah. The first time I ever really had an encounter with Peter Coffin, and it was, I think we had talked a few times on Twitter or whatever. But it was when I created a video, it was years ago, back around 2018, I think, 2019 maybe, called Intersectionalism is Not Enough. And I was like, I was arguing that if you want to take a look at what the intersectional doctrine actually was, it was a legal doctrine that had some use for, workers in the 70s, and might not have been entirely wrong in the context of suing your employer for discrimination, but that in terms of a revolutionary struggle to overcome the root causes of our dilemmas, that in trying to actually address the inequities and oppression that's built into the capitalist system, that intersectionalism was nowhere near enough, and that we couldn't turn to it to be the horizon of our politics. And Peter Coffin came after me on Twitter like you wouldn't believe. He was like, why don't you just say what you really mean, you racist, and things like that. And then we met in person in Idaho at a conference where it was like a left-wing conference to critique, but also take seriously the ideas of Jordan Peterson. And we had a conversation in a panel discussion, and I sort of think I won him over a little bit. And then a few years later, I'm hearing that he's a patriotic socialist and he's being completely canceled. And I was like, oh dear, did I make him go full right wing? Did he take me wrong? I mean, that's not what I meant. But then I talked to him and I was like, no, that's just he's being attacked in bad faith by a lot of different people. But I just thought it might be interesting for you to know that that's my story with Peter Coffin, that everyone kind of starts out on the left and trying to accommodate themselves to the left as it is, I think. And then you have to go through a process of understanding and self-critique and critique of the left to develop.
Well, people learn. I've evolved over the years. I feel like my core beliefs remain the same, but I've certainly changed my perspective on a lot of things. And, Peter's work is amazing. I have learned so much. I've got Woke Ouroboros behind me, one of a brilliant book that he wrote. Yeah. And his work regarding fandoms is very, very good. The Marx for Sale documentary and such. I mean, where he talks about how fandoms are very toxic. They become less and less political over time. They're designed to be niche and exclusive. And I mean, he's done great things regarding that. And, but I can tell a similar story to what you just told about a guy named Rainer Shea. Rainer Shea is a young activist in California. For years, I would hear about Rainer Shea being hostile to me. Rainer Shea was always posting negative things, and he was into Maoist, third worldist or whatever stuff. But then he realized that the main danger is World War III. And so he said that, look, this Rage Against the War Machine rally is bringing together Republicans and others who oppose World War III. And that's a good development. And they all came for him, and he realized what was going on. And now Rainer and I are good friends. And Rainer is a member of the Center for Political Innovation. We're going to publish a book that he wrote pretty soon. And it shows that people can change, right? And that's the point. And that, growth is a big thing. And that's what, that's the whole, you read the Christian Gospels, the prodigal son. And I am all for forgiveness, right? If somebody who's dissed me on the internet comes to me and says, hey, I wasn't right, I don't go, oh, get away from. No, I have reconciled with many people over the years who've been particularly unfriendly. I will say, however, and I'm not going to get into specifics because I don't want to start that up again, right? I have no obligation to run after big social media influencers and beg for them to reconcile with me, right? And that is something, and that is something that there are a lot of people trying to pressure me to do right now. And I'm sorry,
I'm not going to name names, but
I'm not going to name names, but there are a number of people. Oh, why don't you just go beg to join this group? Or why don't you? No, I'm not going to do that. Right. I mean, if people have made clear they don't want to be working with me, if people have had the opportunity over and over and over again to, heal the wound and they don't want to, I'm sorry, I'm not going to humiliate myself that way. Right. And as Jimmy Dore frequently says, these people know how to reach me. And the one thing I don't like is when people on the internet try to be the back channel. They have it in their head, well, I'm going to be the person. And it's part of the fandom syndrome. They're a fan of this voice online and they're a fan of your voice online. And in their minds, they want to keep liking both shows. So they're going to try to heal the group. No. If this person wants to reach me, fine. but don't play games with me. And I'm done with the internet. I really, really am. I have a message. I have an idea. And I'm at the point where we're transitioning away from the communist label in CPI. I mean, we clearly are. We quote Marx and, my life story and all of that. But if you say communist to average Americans, they think you're woke. And I am an innovationist. That is the essence of what Marx taught. It was historical progress. It was technology. It was man's creative power. The idea that we can expand the productive forces to the ultimate stage, higher stage of communism. And I want to communicate to people that I want economic growth and I want to make their lives better. And if I say I'm a communist, people think I want destruction and vengeance and chaos, and I don't want that, right? And so, the term innovationist is now the term that CPI is starting to embrace as our perspective when we present ourselves. We're not denouncing Marxism and socialism, and we obviously think our interpretation of it is correct, but our interpretation of Marxism and socialism is so far away from what your average person calling yourself that in the United States thinks right now. It doesn't do us any favors to go around waving the red flag.
When I went to the RNC on the way to the RNC. This is one of these anecdotes that I know I'm going to tell too many times eventually, but I don't think I've told it too many times yet. I flew from Las Vegas to Milwaukee, and on the plane from Las Vegas, I was seated next to a Trump supporter, and we got to talking for a little while. And I didn't talk about my politics; he didn't talk about his. We were talking about our personal lives. We hit it off. Both of us being middle-aged guys, I guess we had something in common. And then a deadhead came and sat on the aisle, and right away you could just tell looking at him, this is a deadhead hippie. He was also middle-aged, around 50, and we started talking about the RNC and Trump, and the 4 hours on that flight went by very quickly. And by the end of it, I had been invited to his house for a barbecue, and brought my film crew with me to film it. He was not going to the RNC. He was going home. He lived in Milwaukee. He was a Trump supporter, but not excited by it at all. Not that political. And when I went to the barbecue, I interviewed his son, and I was talking to him about what he thought about politics. This 20-year-old kid. And what he said was what he really wanted was to be in a society, or he didn't say society. He said, I just want to have a life where I can have friends and we can disagree about politics. We can argue with each other as much as we want, get really down into it, be vicious with each other, and then know that we love each other and we're friends at the end. And when I was at the RNC overall, and I was talking to people on the street, that came up in different ways again and again. And one of the things I think that is really true about this moment that people on the left should recognize is that we've been duped into playing along with a very divisive strategy for the last 8 years.
Yes.
And that the people in this country, by and large, are our friends and neighbors. They don't want to hate us. There's no reason for us to hate them. And whether they're Democrats or Republicans is really a secondary thing. And if we could start to try to organize on that basis in the real world, I think that socialism might have a shot.
Yeah,
because that's what socialism
I couldn't agree more.
Primarily about. Yeah.
So there you go. Well, I appreciate you having me on, Doug. And I know you're a book guy, so this is particularly of interest to you as a longtime publisher. So I will certainly keep you up to date on how this develops. But right now, I'll just end our current project. We're raising money on GoFundMe. We plan to distribute 1,000 copies of this book that has been banned on the streets of the Chicago during the DNC. That's the plan. And we have a GoFundMe set up. I've got the link. I sent you the link. And we figure if they took this book down and they don't want this out there, it needs to get out there. So we wrote a new introduction. Peter designed a beautiful cover for the new book, the new edition of the book. And so if people want to help us out with that, that would be great, because obviously there's something in this book that needs to be said. That's why they banned it.
Yep. And I will put a link to it in the description. Thanks for coming on, and I hope to talk to you again, Caleb.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.